that brings us to our main story, which is COP27 and the climate outcomes. And I know there will be debate over the use of the word outcomes there. But John, do you want to talk us through with maybe a little bit of what COP was, what it is?
That sounds very final. What it was, let's
What it
pour one
was.
out. I feel like we had to cover this week just because, both because I think it was a little bit undercovered generally, but also it's super important, right? So for those who aren't necessarily aware what it is, it's the UN Climate Change Conference. Conference of Parties is the COP bit, which is typical UN dexterity.
Completely incomprehensible.
I know. It's a running joke in our newsletter about just like someone needs to start a marketing agency that works for international organizations just to help them move away from this kind of nonsense. But anyway,
you don't think that was $3 million in consultancy fees?
All right. Yeah, exactly.
Please, John.
They need to get better consultants. Anyway, the conference was held over 2 weeks in Egypt and it wrapped up last Sunday. It was supposed to wrap up on Saturday, but they pushed it for an extra day to push through emergency negotiations. Obviously, this comes against the backdrop of terrible floods in Pakistan in September, which I think had huge swathes of the country underwater. And that becomes emblematic of the climate challenge facing the world. But then also the Ukraine-Russia war, which people are more focused on than maybe less tangible results about how to combat climate change. So there's this real tension at the moment between things that are urgent and immediate and the fact that it's getting harder and harder to act like climate change isn't urgent and immediate. The results were, well, we can get into that, but it happened at the same time as all the leaders were in the G20 in Bali. So I think that also probably shifted a bit of focus away. But Dimitri, what were your takeaways from the results of COP?
So first, I wasn't surprised that it went over. Most multilateral negotiations I've ever been a part of end up going over, because it is only when you are staring down the barrel of no outcome at all that ministers begin to move off red lines. And then once they've done that, you're like, yeah, cool. We now need to find language that captures this. Like, how do we make this real? So I'm not surprised by that. I will say, looking at it, these COPs, these major conferences will aim to do 70 things at once. But the three things that it seemed were the focus of this one was, firstly, damage and loss. So creating a fund that would effectively channel money to those countries and those communities that have been irreparably harmed by a worsening climate. Second, there was an attempt by some members to water down the 1.5 degree target, by some to defend it, and by some to improve it. And so there was a massive fight over that. And then thirdly, this was seen by the Egyptian hosts as an implementation COP, where at previous COPs, members had made all sorts of pledges, and the Egyptians wanted to use this COP to look at how governments were actually putting those pledges into action, because the climate community has a lot of frustrations with people said things, but they don't appear to be doing them. John, on this 1.5 degree question and on the climate, high inflation, everybody is freaking out about energy prices. Did this have a hope in hell?
No, is the short answer, right? Like, you could probably give a craftier answer that's probably a little bit more accurate, but no is the short answer. If you look at politicians in the countries that participated, it's artificially framed as take care of your people or deal with climate change. I mean, I think you absolutely can do both, but when the rubber meets the road, there were a lot of people who were saying to do some of the things that the COP would ask us to do would mean short-term higher energy prices for our people, which at this time is a political non-starter. They've got to get re-elected, or at the very least, they have a duty of care to their citizens to not push a cost of living crisis even higher. When I framed the question as takes place against the backdrop of Ukraine and Russia war, and I meant attention-wise, but what you're drilling down there is like that war has changed the fundamental dynamics of what politicians are willing to do when it comes to solving collective action problems. Because they're saying when everything's peaceful, we can look beyond our borders and we can say, oh, let's deal with some of these really difficult questions, blah, blah, blah. Oh, wait, the wolf is metaphorically at the door. Let's get our house in order. I mean, that's how I would frame it. So the answer is no, it didn't have a hope in hell of getting through this COP. But then I I ask myself, and maybe it's an inappropriate question, but like, is it just a convenient excuse that you can say it's a true excuse? But
Mm.
what would it, absent the war, would we have gotten there? I mean, I'm getting more cynical about this stuff. And, you know, living in America, every election cycle, people scream about gas prices, and rightly so. That's a big part of people's budgets. But at some point, these kinds of things, these kinds of commitments to combat climate change require people to be out of pocket, to pay more, to make difficult decisions. And I haven't seen much political will anywhere really to kind of actually properly do that. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can't help but think that if the test for climate action is that there is absolutely nothing bad going on in the world, and that
Yeah,
there are no pressures on working families, as politicians call them, shorthand for like everybody. If we wait until some moment when absolutely everyone in the country is
ready to deal with it,
content
right?
and ready to
Yeah,
make sacrifices, we are not going to make a difference.
no,
But I would say, kind of on a more optimistic note, what we've seen over and over again is, at least by some metrics, actual performance has exceeded commitments in all sorts of ways. The pace of renewables have raced ahead of even what governments have been willing to commit to.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's right. I think maybe that's for people who are saying the government central, the government idea that governments should drive climate change efforts. The people who would push back against that say you can only ever do so much as a government. The people who
Yeah.
need to actually be involved in this is the private sectors. I mean, the people who develop the technologies that are going to help us move from fossil fuels to renewables are not going to be, well, very rarely are they going to be the government organizations doing it. They're the ones who can set the conditions, the signals for the private sector to go and invest. And so in one case, I'm not surprised that once there is a clear understanding of where the market is going and where investment is going to go and where the investment rules are going to go, then I'm not surprised that renewable adoption outpaces what we thought. Because once you have everyone pulling in the same direction, solves a lot of the problems. I think that's one of the key things to note from this COP, and why I'm a little bit more optimistic about what came out of this COP than I think many are in the media. And that's this climate fund reparations bit, whatever you want to call it, this idea that developing, poor, emerging countries expected to be hit by climate change disproportionately, there's a fund there, or there's at least the signal of a fund that will say, we are going to compensate you for the changes that you're going to have to make, because we know that it's not going to be cheap and it's not fair on you. And before I throw it back to you, I think the reason I use the word signal there is that's so important, because it says Western governments are going to provide money. We're going to prepare the ground for private investment to focus on this. Presumably, they've got the developing countries on board who are saying, we're going to create the investment conditions that you can come into our country and feel more safe than you might otherwise would with a normal private sector investment. And then if you can kind of get those signals matched up, that's when you start to hopefully get the financiers in and the companies, either startups or whatever it is, coming in to actually make a difference. But these things happen over years, decades, which is, I guess, the fundamental tension of climate change, is we probably don't have that long.
On that fund, a lot of the criticism, and I think it's entirely legitimate, is that they agreed the notion of a fund. They did
Yeah,
not agree any of the details of the fund, including where the money will come from, apart from a general direction. They haven't agreed how it will be distributed. They haven't agreed the criteria. And so it is, I think, entirely legitimate for the activist community to say, well, yeah, but is this actually going to happen? Where is
right.
the money? Is this going to be an empty shell of a fund? And I do think that's a legitimate criticism.
Totally.
What
I agree.
what I would say, though, on the flip side, is so much of the UN is about precedent and statements of fundamental belief and value. Things like common but differentiated responsibility when it comes to climate, this idea that everyone has a responsibility to deal with climate change, but you have to differentiate between different countries in how much. Getting that across the line completely reshaped all of the climate processes thereafter for years. And
Yeah.
so I do think there is tremendous value in actually agreeing at a multilateral level, the COP level, the fundamental premise that A, climate change is going to cause damage that can't be locally repaired. B, that there is a duty and an obligation, a global community to help address it. And C, that the burden of that responsibility should fall on the historic polluters.
Yeah. And that's what I was talking about with the signal, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that like, this is what we're telling. Now, there's a lot of meat to be put on the bones and a lot of things can change, but like the signal is these things are what we believe and we're going to figure out the rest as we go along. And the activist community, as you said, is entirely right to be frustrated by the pace of that. Yeah. They're frustrated by the fact that there's no details, no commitments, nothing can be held against anybody else because these agreements are always drafted to be so vague as to be not worth much. But the signal is, I think, really important. And the fact is, this is the most complicated negotiation to deal with. I mean, if you were doing this in one of your explain trade mock negotiation workshops, you wouldn't be able to mock up all the different variables and interests and parties. And it's like orders of magnitude. So in one sense, it's quite amazing that we're even able to get what we get out of it. Now, that doesn't mean we should all put the tools down and say, good job, aren't we great? We came up with an agreement to say we'll agree in the future. But I don't think that doom and gloom is necessarily the way to approach this, both from the media and from people's attitudes towards it. Because there is some good news about the signals.
Just a final
Or am I struggling? Am I coping too hard, maybe?
Well, listen, somebody's got to. Something that... This is going to be like a note that is of relevance to like 3 people worldwide, but something that I found quite funny in a sad way reading the negotiations about this fund is that it tripped up on something that the WTO has been tripping up on for 10 years, which is when they started defining who the fund is for, the developed countries wanted to differentiate between very large economies like China and other developing countries, which developing countries didn't want to do because they see that as splintering. And of course, China massively objected to. And so where they ended up is where a lot of the WTO negotiations recently have ended up, with language that says that wealthier developing countries can choose to contribute to this fund, and that the priority for the fund's money will go to countries that are a little bit less economically powerful than others. But it was just a very funny parallel how this keeps coming up of how do you give developing countries something without giving it to a country that you don't consider to be a valid recipient of aid or assistance because of the size of their economy. Just that all roads lead to depressing Rome is, I guess, what I wanted to finish this one on.
Here I am trying to find whatever silver lining there is, and then the last word goes to you where you're like, everything's pretty fucked.
Thanks so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please give us a like, a comment, and subscribe to the channel to be notified as soon as we put up new videos. Also, don't forget that down below is a link to the amazing International Intrigue free daily newsletter so that you can be ahead of the news at those water cooler conversations. Thanks so much.